Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be covering my top lane tier list for the new season that just dropped, patch 14.19. And just in case you missed it, I've been streaming Korean solo queue 5 days a week, playing on the new patch, trying out all these new strong champions, so I'd love to see you there. Link will be in the description. Now, some of you might notice from this tier list straight away, it does look quite different from the previous patch, and that's just because of the way they reworked a bunch of the items and added lethal tempo back into the game, really changed the top lane meta as a whole, where champions that love Stridebreaker and Eclipse, these are two of the items that felt the nerf the hardest, they are going to go down. So champions like Riven feeling a bit worse, champions like Garen or Olaf feeling worse, and champions that love, I would say, using lethal tempo, of course, and also using Storm Surge, which is notably a strong item, have gone up. So I'll go through every champion one by one, and again, this is a general tier list, but it is going to be weighted more so towards higher elo. So to specify that, if a champion is close to being, let's say, A or B tier, but they are A tier and high elo, or B tier and low elo, I'll put them in A, so it's going to be weighted more so towards high elo, but keep in mind it should be within a 1 tier difference depending on your rank. So we'll start off in S tier. Now Yone is, in my opinion, the strongest top laner in the entire patch. He was already really strong last season, he was broken in mid lane, and underrated top. You could take Conquer in a lot of matchups, and do quite well, where pretty much every player was just taking Fleet unnecessarily, but now with lethal tempo he's even stronger, and I would say he's just straight up overpowered. He can win a lot of these matchups. You spike really hard on 1 to 2 items, you're strong early, strong late, spike hard in the mid game. There's no real big weakness of this champion right now, and it's been really hard for me to get a game of him. In current solo queue he gets banned pretty much every game. They've already caught on after 1 day how broken this champion is. And as for Kennen, he's also a big benefactor to this patch. Not only did all the Eclipse and Stridebreaker champions get a bit weaker, but also Mercury Treads got nerfed. They cost 1300 gold, which is really hard to get, and if you even get them, let's say you're playing Jax or Darius into Kennen, already a hard matchup, now it's 1300 to get Mercs, which made the matchup more playable. You're delaying your Triforce or your Stridebreaker by 1300, which makes this matchup really difficult, and also Storm Surge is really OP at the moment. Kennen uses that item extremely well. He's a champion that doesn't really have any bad matchups, spikes really hard early, great in lane, so just an S tier champion all around. Moving down to A tier. Now some of you may be surprised to see some of the champions here, notably Camille, Jax, Fiora. You might be thinking, oh, true damage is going to be so good, damage reduced, or lethal tempo's back, Jax is going to be OP. And they are really good champions, don't get me wrong. That's why they're my top 3 in A tier, but they're just not as powerful as Kennen and Yone, so I did have to separate them. Now, the reason Fiora's not on S tier, even though she's a great champion, is because the Ravenous Hydra nerf is significant, you definitely feel it, and the Eclipse nerf as well, where Ravenous Hydra into Eclipse, really great cheap 2 item spike on Fiora, so your spikes, your main 2 spikes are weaker. You don't go Eclipse anymore, most likely you will go Triforce, Hullbreaker, or Death Stance as your second item, which is a lot more expensive, so it takes longer to come online, but still a great champion. She'll also struggle into Kennen, into Vlad, into Aurora, whose value's gone up a little bit, so she will have some hard matchups, but still a great champion all around. And as for Jax, he is a lot stronger on this patch with the addition to lethal tempo and a lot more fun. A lot of these hard skill matchups like a Fiora or these matchups where you want to snowball early like a Warwick or an Aatrox, you actually have realistic kill threat against him now. It feels so much better, so much more carry potential. The only reason he's not on S tier is because he still really feels the 17-second cooldown on E from a couple patches ago. That makes a lot of these really volatile matchups difficult because you can take a great trade with E, but if you're versing a champion that can fight you back, you have to wait 17 seconds where you might have to give minions or respect or not trade. That is such a long time to give your opponent breathing room in the lane, so not quite as strong. Also, Merc Treads being nerfed makes one of his 2 biggest counters, Kennen and Gragas, way harder than before. But also with cookies not giving you mana, it does make it quite tricky. Now despite all of this, you can take Presence of Mind to make up for the cookies, but despite these laning issues you might run into, I was close to putting him in S tier. The only reason I'm not is he doesn't have a great second item that he loves. Stridebreaker got nerfed, doesn't feel that good, Sterak's doesn't feel that good. There's no standout item that feels great as a second item for him. I tested Titanic Hydra, also doesn't feel that great, so it doesn't really matter that much what you buy, it depends on the game, but lethal tempo does make a lot of these matchups a lot better, and still a great champion on the patch. I'd have him high A or low S depending on the bracket. Now for Camille, I know a lot of people were thinking, because they're reducing the usefulness of items, the damage from everything, that true damage champions were going to reign supreme, and they did get a little bit of value. I'd say the damage reduction across the board is not as high as people were expecting, so they did only get a slight increase, but Camille's in a good spot. I'd say Shield Bash is a nice addition to her. She feels really good with that Shield Bash buff. You really feel it, it really chunks in the early game, so in a lot of scenarios where I have taken Demolish before, I'm going to swap over to Shield Bash more often because you do feel feel the power in that. The issue I have is second item doesn't feel great either. Where Ravenous Hydra got nerfed, Titanic Hydra doesn't feel that good, so she doesn't have a really nice second item, but you're still Camille. If you get to 3 items, you get your Death Stance, or Sterak's depending on the game, or maybe more. You're going to be really powerful in the game. Damage reduction does benefit this champion, of course, in some way, and she doesn't really have that many extremely hard matchups, so a great champion in total. Moving on to Gwen. Now, Gwen's a big fan of the direction of this patch, where lower damage across the board. She does insane damage, so much true damage, as long as you don't get blown up. If the fights go longer, that benefits her. And I'd say the biggest difference, the why I've got her higher than usual, is because pretty much every other champion is hurting a little bit on this patch. So give Darius, for example, Stridebreaker getting nerfed is really tough for him, especially with how his bleed work with that item. But now Gwen, Riftmaker is an item that got nerfed, I'd say the least, out of the majority of top lane build, items that you can build in top lane. So she benefits quite a lot from this patch in terms of itemization, but also everyone else's items getting worse as well. And speaking of Darius, this is already a champion that has mobility issues, so with Stridebreaker not having its movement speed passive anymore, it is going to be quite tricky. You're probably going to go Triforce more often. We'll see what the Darius 1 tricks are cooking up this week, but I would say Triforce is going to be more of a standard item on him into heavy melee comps or melee top jungle than Stridebreaker before, but you still will need to go Stridebreaker versus range matchups, and that lack of movement speed you're really going to feel in these games. Now, as for Sett, to be honest, looking at him right there, I don't think he's in the right place. I'm going to be moving him down here. And this is a general tier list. If this was a high elo only list, I'd probably put him in low B tier or high C tier. But because it's a general list, he does really well in lower elo brackets. Garen getting nerfed is good for him. I'd say the lower damage games is great for him. He does so much true damage on W. If the game length increases because damage is lower, that's also going to benefit him a lot. So he's just a great champion. I'd say an Emerald and below. He's going to do quite well there. But keep in mind, trying to play him in high elo brackets will be quite tricky. If you verse a good Kennen or Aurora player, you're probably going to get rolled in lane, and it's going to be really hard to get high value in team fights on this champion if people are good at marking flanks and stuff like that. So it's a champion that's really hard to execute in higher brackets, but because he's so good in lower brackets, really good laning, uses these HP items well, I'm going to be keeping him in A tier for now. Moving on to Tryndamere, and Tryndamere on the previous patch was pretty much just the ultimate neutralizer. If you're in Ravenous Hydra with Grasp, Infinite Sustain, one-shot waves, really hard to get punished on this champion, but not as much carry potential as in previous years. But now you have that flexibility back. You can go Ravenous Hydra in games where you want to snowball, or you want more carry potential, and you can go Grasp Ravenous Hydra in games where the matchup's quite hard and you just want to out-sustain and neutralize them. So a lot of flexibility, great patch for him. Now as for Aurora, she's very hard for me to place. I'd say for a low elo tier list she'd be C, maybe mid elo tier list I'd put her B, but a high elo I'd say she is an A tier champion. So I'm close to putting her in B tier. I'll just keep her in A for now. I think she's a really strong champion in lane, really hard to counter, and her ulti nerf is good. It made her go from S tier to A tier in my opinion, but because she's so powerful in lane, it spikes really hard early. Malignance I think even got buffed or slightly nerfed, it didn't really get affected that much. She's going to be in a lot better of a position than all the champions that are crying because Eclipse and Stridebreaker is so weak. Now as for Gragas, he did get a little bit of a buff on this patch because Mercury Treads got nerfed, where pretty much every bruiser up against Gragas, you'd want to get Merc Treads early, and that would change how the trading patterns go. But now they're so expensive, so hard to get, so he does get a little bit better in that aspect. But also, strong AD bruiser items getting nerfed is better for him, and he is already a champion that's pretty unpunishable in lane. So he's a champion that's a great blind pick, really hard to lose lane on, and useful in team fights. Can spike hard. I'm guessing there's going to be some Storm Surge builds getting cooked up, a high damage build to give you carry threat. So just a strong champion in general, not as high carry potential as champions like Fiora, Jax, Camille, Yone, which is why he's a lot lower than them, but still a consistent champion that you can get a lot of value on and really hard to lose a lane on. Now as for Illaoi, the reason I've increased her stocks a little bit is just because her main item, if you remember previous seasons, Iceborne Gauntlet, got buffed to the point where it's quite strong, the slow is quite high, and with all items getting nerfed, all other items, her stocks are going to increase. Now Black Cleaver getting nerfed is a bit annoying for her in certain matchups, so I'm going to be putting her in A tier, for I'll say Emerald and below, but for high low I'd be keeping her around B tier. Now as for Warwick, this is definitely a champion I underrated in the previous seasons, where after watching some really good Korean one-tricks play him last season, The champion actually looks surprisingly strong, and with lethal tempo coming back, I have a suspicion he's going to be even stronger, where you can take tempo in some matchups, increase your kill threat, so he's definitely a champion that I would put in A tier. The trade-off is you can only play this champion if you're a one-trick. I've never met somebody that says they play, let's say, Jax and Yone, and Warwick as their counterpick, nothing like that. Warwick is a champion that you only play Warwick, you're either full Fury or you just don't play him at all. And we already covered Sett, so I'm going to be jumping straight to Riven. Now, Riven is definitely going to feel weaker on this patch than the previous one. With the nerf to Eclipse and Black Cleaver, she's not going to feel as strong. So the reason I've still got her in A tier, she is still a really good solo queue champion. She has high carry potential, she's still going to spike hard at 1 to 2 items, even though that spike is not going to be as high as last time. Every other champion is in the same boat to a degree, where Garen, champs like Olaf, you're not going to feel as good without Stridebreaker, even Triforce got nerfed. Of course the Eclipse nerf is a bit more painful than all of these other item nerfs, so she is going to be not as good, but still a great solo queue champion with strong laning phase, granted you have the mastery to back it up. Next up we have Vladimir, and Vlad is a big fan of this current patch. All of the strong bruiser items getting nerfed quite hard, great for him. You're not going to be building Stridebreaker on him or anything like that, of course. And the Storm Surge being OP, really good on this champion. He has a strong laning phase. Stay away from that W max. They did do the hotfix nerf on it, so you can just go airy with Q max and just play like a normal Vladimir. You've got a pretty good kill through in your lane, good carry potential in the game, scale really well, and you just spike harder. While your items are not as nerfed, they are nice spikes than all of these other bruiser champions. Now, Aatrox is in a similar boat to Riven, where all of his favorite items got nerfed. Profane Hydra feels a bit worse, Eclipse feels bad, so he's not in a great position. I'm still going to keep him in A tier for now. He may drop to B tier in the future. The reason for that, he's still got a strong laning phase, he's a pretty stable blind. You still spike really hard at 1 to 2 items, as long as you're carrying the game hard during that timer. You're still going to be useful in the game, but you're definitely going to feel weaker than the previous patch. Now for Cassiopeia, she is a champion where you pretty much have to be a one-trick or main her. She's so powerful in lane, no bad matchups. Her items nerfs are not as painful as bruiser nerfs, so she's going to be in a pretty good spot on this patch, but you need to have extremely high mastery on this champion. Now Malphite, I'm going to put him in A tier. He's not going to be an A tier total champion. You don't want to main Malphite or one-trick him, but if you pick him in the correct locations, if you use him as a counter pick only, he is an A tier champion, really impactful, uses tank items well of course. You can go AP if you want with Malignant, and just a champion that's really impactful, granted you are good at champ select. Moving on to Zac, who's a champion that's going to benefit from the overall direction of the patch as a whole, with less damage in the game. He's a drain tank champion, so you can out-sustain a lot of the damage they're doing to you. He's really strong in lane. With Grasp, you can get a lot of good trades down. You can play for kills, good all-in threat, really good engage. I'd say just a really powerful champion in solo queue with great matchups, and with less damage being in the game, your out-sustain drain tank style is going to get more value. Now, our last champion is a champ that's quite underrated, which is why I made him mini champ guide on him. Nocturne is going to be a little bit stronger in this patch, I would say, with the option to take lethal tempo. Now, lethal tempo, if you remember Nocturne in the past, made your early game really good. So your 1 to 3 is going to have a lot more kill threat than taking Conqueror. You can still go the Jack of all trades build that their Korean Nocturne was doing, and Glacial Shroud did get buffed, which is a nice little quality of life for him. Now, Stridebreaker nerf is annoying for him, but it's not really as big of a deal as it is on other champions, so he's still going to be quite strong. I would say B or low A, depending on the bracket. Moving down to B tier. Now, some of you may be surprised to see Garen here, as he's pretty much the king for the majority of the last season, but now he's really feeling the nerf to these items, where Stridebreaker no movement speed, PDMS is nerfed, even Berserker Greaves got nerfed. All of his items that he liked building did get nerfed, so he is going to be weaker on this patch than before. Now, in lower elo brackets, I'd even say Emerald and below, he's still going to be an A tier, high A tier champion, really good carry potential, really easy to get through your lane if you're not versing in a very experienced laner. So still a very powerful champion, but because it's going to be really hard for you to get to these spikes, and when you do, they're not going to be as strong as before. In higher elo brackets, I'm going to be putting him at the top of B tier instead of A tier, just because it's really hard to get heaps of value from this champion up against really experienced laners. But of course, the Garen one tricks are still going to make him work. They're still going to be able to get Masters Plus, still a strong champion in lower elo brackets, so don't be scared to pick him just because he's not as powerful as last season. Moving on to Olaf. Now, it is quite tough for me to demote my boy down to B tier, but he's really struggling on this patch, where before I actually felt he was quite strong and quite underrated, but now with cookies losing their mana, which is a pretty big deal, considering how many mana nerfs we've had throughout this year on Olaf, it's really hard for you to go through your lane without getting constantly even if you take Presence of Mind. Now, with Stride Breaker being nerfed, that is the nail in the coffin for me, where the movement speed really important on this champion, of course. Where if you hit your Q, you're going to get movement speed from the previous Stride Breaker. Not going to be the case anymore. And Ravenous Hydra, I would assume you could have just swapped from Stride to Ravenous. That is also weaker as well. Now, he's still going to be strong. He's still going to be playable, of course. And he's going to be A tier in, I would say, mid-range elo bracket. So still a good champion, but you really have to play around these mana costs. It's quite tricky. And your 1 to 2 item spike is nowhere near as strong as before. Moving on to Urgot. Now, this is a champion that I do feel will struggle a lot more on this patch, with Black Cleaver being heavily nerfed, and Hullbreaker being harder to rush as a first item, as you're buying primarily HP, really little AD on this item now, so he's definitely going to struggle a lot more on this patch than he did previously. I'd say high B, low B, depending on the bracket, but pretty much an average champion across the board. Next up we have Trundle, and Trundle finally has a rune that he can take that he enjoys. Lethal Tempo Trundle is back, and he's going to be in a really strong spot, especially in lower elo brackets. The only reason he's in B tier and not in A tier is just because it's really hard to play Trundle into really good Kennen or Aurora. Pretty much any ranged top players. Lethal Tempo Vayne might make an appearance as well, so that can be quite tricky for you. So there are some unplayable ranged matchups that you might face on this champion, but in general, if you're in a bracket where ranged top players aren't that good, or you see your matchup Trundle's going to be in a really good spot now, especially because Bork didn't really get nerfed that hard. Ravenous Hydra nerf is a bit of an annoying thing for Trundle, but Rev Hydra Bork's still a great spike onto him, and he's still going to be a split push demon with the Lethal Tempo. Moving on to Mordekaiser. Now, the more I look into his eyes behind that helmet and think about it, I would say I've underrated him a little bit. I'm going to be moving him up into A tier. Now, this is because in low elo brackets, I think he's going to be in a great spot, with all the Eclipse and Stride Breaker and Triforce items getting worse, and his not really getting changed that much. I'd say he's a subtle benefactor to this patch, so I'm going to be putting him into A tier for that. In high elo brackets, I'll still say he's high B tier, which is where I initially placed him, which is why he was there, but as it's a general tier list, I'm going to be giving him a little bit of a promotion. He's a champion that doesn't really get negatively impacted from this patch that much. And as for Akali, this is always a champion that I believe is a really strong counter pick in top lane. She does quite well into a lot of these really strong top laners at the moment if you pick her as a counter, and she didn't really get her items didn't get really nerfed that much. In fact, Storm Surge is OP. I'd say she's even A tier in high elo brackets as a counter, but because she's quite hard to play and her early lane is quite weak, I'm going to be keeping her in B tier as a solid counter pick. Now, Kayle, she is going to be a lot better on this patch. I was the biggest Kayle hater for a while because Lethal Tempo was removed, and not only is it bad for learning, just sitting there with Fleet waiting till 6, and not being useful till 11, especially with Void Grubs in the game, but there's not really many matchups that you could hard bully on the previous patch, but now with Lethal Tempo, you can actually get prio and play quite aggressive, and maybe even play for kills, especially at level 6. Now, Berserker Greaves being nerfed is also bad for her, so I was close to putting her into C tier, but I know she is going to be quite strong in lower elo brackets, especially if the game time goes longer with less damage in the game, so I'd say she's quite an average B tier champion, but still extremely hard to pick in high elo brackets. Now, as for Wukong, in the previous patch, I definitely underrated this champion after watching some good one-tricks playing him and trying out their build for myself, where they'd go TP Ignite with no flash, as you don't really need flash on this champion, and Grasp in a lot of hard matchups. He's actually a really powerful champion, but now Triforce and Profane Hydra, which was your main 2-item spike, did get quite heavily nerfed in the form of gold efficiency and the Profane Hydra active, so he is going to be worse than before. And also with Lethal Tempo champs coming back, they're going to do a bit better into him, so I'd say he's a middle of the pack, high B tier champion. Now, as for Kled, this is definitely a champion that I'd like to get more data on and wait and see what the one tricks are cooking up. For now, I'm going to be keeping him around the middle of the pack, but I feel like with the way that the new items are going, with Titanic Hydra and Hullbreaker being heavily favored for HP stackers, there's going to be some build cooked up that makes him quite strong, so we're going to be keeping our eye on him, but for now, we'll be keeping him in B tier. Now for Vayne, she's going to be stronger on this patch. I'll say the easiest part about versing Vayne before is they all had to take Fleet, so her all-in damage was extremely low, so you could all-in her even if there was a big HP disadvantage. But now, because she has Lethal Tempo, if you remember versing her in the past, where if you miss position in your lane and it's near her side, she can just pop Ghost with Lethal and just run you down the entire lane. That's probably going to be back now. Of course, Lethal doesn't give the attack range anymore, so it won't be as bad, but it's still going to be in a situation where if you're playing these beefy beefy immobile bruiser champs and they pick Vayne into you, it is going to be quite a tough time. Moving on to Nasus. Now this would be a champion I'd put in A tier if this was for a lower elo tier list, but I'll be keeping him in B for now. He's still going to be similar to before, even though in theory less damage in the game's great for him, games going longer, things of that nature. He's still going to be the same champion where if you go even or ahead in lane, you're going to be very strong. If you get shit on in lane, you're going to be struggling quite a lot and your lane phase is quite weak. So pretty similar to previous season in my opinion, except for the other champions one item spike is worse. But you're not going to lose lane at one item on Nasus if you're even until then, so it doesn't really change anything for him. Now as for Sion, I feel like there's going to be some builds cooked up with Titanic Hydra and Hullbreaker, so I'm going to be keeping him in high B tier for now, but keeping our eye on the boss and see how well he's doing. Now as for Udep, this champion, I did assume initially that he's going to be getting better on this patch, but I still feel like he's just a meatball that has to do really well in the early game and carry hard during that 1 to 2 item spike, and that doesn't really change much for him. I'd say he's better in the sense where Stridebreaker and Eclipse is worse, which is great for him, and he didn't really have an item that he loved, so I'll just be keeping him B tier as a strong early laning champion that you can use to carry the game early, but you're still going to have the same problems in the late game, and if you don't get ahead in lane, you're not going to be that useful. Now for Yorick, again he's kind of similar to Nasus in a way. I'm not going to touch on champions that didn't change that much for a long time. I feel like he's going to be in relatively the same place. Profane Hydra nerf and Triforce nerf does affect him, so these items that are getting nerfed, items that he loves, is going to keep him relatively similar to the majority of the other champions, and with Lethal Tempo being back, matchups like Jax and Yone are going to be even harder for him, so he's actually going to be slightly worse on this patch. Now for Volibear, I did assume he'd be a little bit better with Lethal Tempo, and I still think he will be, but he's still got the same problem as Volibear where if you don't get hit in the early game, you don't really have much value. You're not that good at team fighting, not as strong inside as other champions, so he's still a champion that you have to snowball really hard early on, and Lethal Tempo can make this easier in a lot of matchups, but most champions avoid long trains versus Volibear anyway, so it's not the biggest difference in the world for this champ. Now for Jace, I'd say he's a little bit weaker on this patch with Eclipse being nerfed. That does hurt him quite a lot, and with Lethal Tempo champs coming back, he can't really benefit from it. He's pretty good into lots of Lethal Tempo champs like Trundle and Jax, so it's not the biggest deal in the world for him, but the Yone matchup could be more tricky now. I'd say the main problem I have, why I've demoted him to B tier, he's a champion that's really hard to play in lower elo brackets. I'd be putting him in low A tier in a high elo list, but Eclipse being nerfed does make him a lot harder to play. Now for Pantheon, the reason he's demoted now is because all of his favorite items get nerfed, where the Eclipse nerf is really hard for him, Black Cleaver nerf is bad, Spirit Shojin doesn't feel as good as it did before, so he's definitely weaker than he was on the previous patch, and if damage is lower in the game and games are going longer, not what you want to hear if you're a Pantheon main. Now for Aurelia, she's a champion I would be putting in A tier if it was a high elo list, but only for Aurelia mains of course, but because she's really hard to play in lower brackets and hard to speed up the pace of the game on during your 1 to 2 item spike, I'm going to be keeping her in low B tier. She can be a great counter pick if you have high mastery on her, but this patch isn't really that beneficial for her. It's better in the way where other champions are a bit worse, as Bork didn't get nerfed that hard, but she's still going to be relatively the same champion as before, good in the hands of a high elo Aurelia 1 trick, but other than that really hard to play if you don't have high mastery on the champ. Now for Poppy, I'd say she's pretty similar. I'd say she's dead middle of the pack for a lot of these champions, where she's relatively average. She didn't really get that buffed or that nerfed on this patch, not really much change for her. Now Rumble, he's here because he got nerfed so much on the previous patches, where he went from being the most broken champ ever to just being okay to now being slightly weak, and this patch didn't really change that much for him. Now Quinn, there was a build getting cooked around with Stridebreaker or Profane Hydra first. Both of those items, the active does feel a lot worse for you, and the items are just weaker in general, so she's going to be slightly worse, a champion that should only be used as a counter pick. Unless you're a Quinn main banning Malphite, then you can get away with it. Now for Ringa, I'd say it's too early for me to tell right now. I'm going to be keeping him B tier at the moment and see what builds the Ringa mains cook up. With Eclipse being worse, that option is kind of gone for you, so it'd be hard for me to place him right now, but if I had to guess, I'll be putting him into B tier. Moving on to Ornn. Now I was tempted to put Ornn a bit higher because his reforged items are so strong right now, but you still have the same problems. You're still a team reliant tank champion. In solo queue, not the most carry potential at all. You do rely on your team a lot more on this champion than a lot of other champions in the cast, so definitely a champion that I'll be keeping in low B tier, even though the reforged items really late into the game are going to be a bit better. Now for Singed, I'd say doesn't really change much for him. His items got slightly nerfed, not as bad as Eclipse or Black Cleaver or anything like that, but you're still a champion with so many bad matchups that you need to avoid by proxying, so this season doesn't really change anything for you. I'd say a B tier champion in total. And Mundo, quite hard to place. I'll be keeping him low B for now. In lower elo brackets, he'll still be an A tier champion, where if you do even or slightly hit in your lane, you can blow up all the tier 2s on the map and get really fed. But with the Warmog's nerf from before, and it even got nerfed a little bit more, he's just a champion whose laning phase is so weak that in the higher elo brackets, it's going to be quite hard to get to your spike without getting behind. Moving down to C tier. Now Renekton, I'm going to be keeping him in C tier for now. I do have a suspicion that I'll be moving him back up to B tier in the upcoming weeks when I see more sample size of him. But the reason I've got him in C for now is because he's the champion that spikes really hard at 1 to 2 items, but Eclipse and Black Cleaver being nerfed feels extremely bad for him, where if you compare that to a champ like Riven, where you have more options for kills in the lane, you've got more outplay potential in your lane, but also you spike a bit harder at 3 items as well than Renekton, where you've got a death stance as well. Renekton doesn't really have that same spike that Riven does. Later on to the game, you have to get all your carrying down during 1 to 2, but that's just not going to be as strong on this patch. Moving on to Bria. Now this champion's quite hard for me to place. I haven't really seen much of it on this season. I'm just going to assume she's C tier as Eclipse did get nerfed, and that was an item that she liked. Now Cassante, he got nerfed on this patch. He's still playable in the hands of a great Cassante player, but you're definitely going to feel the nerfs. He's not only a little bit weaker, but less fun to play, so he's not in the best spot at all. He's a really hard champion for Riot to balance, but it's really painful if you're a Cassante player to go through these changes time and time again. So I'd say if you are a Cassante player, it might be the good time to learn a second champion. Now as for Gangplank, I'd say he's suffering as well. There's not really any patch that's going to be good for him for a while, so we're going to be keeping him in C tier. The reason he's not in D tier is he can have quite a strong lane if you can get to Sheen unscathed, and you do still scale quite well, so if the game goes for a while, you're still going to be extremely useful. Now for Gnar, I'll keep him in C tier, and high elo he'll be higher of course. He's a great counter pick, but he's really slow paced, takes you a while to get to your items, and with Fleet being nerfed, you're not really going to take lethal tempo on Gnar. Maybe into hard matchups like Aurelia, where you want some all-in threat, something like that, it can be quite good, but not really. You're mainly going to take Fleet on him, and the Fleet nerf did hurt him from last patch, so I'll be keeping him in C tier. Now for Ryze, I would put him higher. I'll keep him in C as I only really want to see him as a counter pick into champs like Ryze or champs like Vladimir or Rumble, maybe even into Kennen. So he can be good into those, but it's very rare that you verse those champions at blind pick in lower elo brackets, so it's really hard to find a good game for him. So definitely just not the strongest champion overall. Now for Akshan, this champion was quite OP mid lane last season, but top lane he was quite weak, and he's going to be in pretty much the same boat, just a counter pick champion that pretty hard to survive ganks, pretty hard to survive all-in threats by these strong champions that can dive onto you, so I'll be keeping him in low C tier. Now Cho'gath, still a champion that's bad in solo queue. You're really immobile, you're really easy to gank, you're really weak early game, you're not that good in skirmishes, your spells are very easy to outplay, so just a not great solo queue champion. We'll be keeping Chogs in C tier. And Shen, he's got the problem where if your name is not Shinding Help, you're not going to be that impactful on him. Surprisingly, there are a lot of people that love Shen, but the reason he's just not that good as a solo queue champion, even on this patch where Titanic Hydra might be a bit better for him, and you know, Eclipse and stuff getting nerfed might be better for his matchups, he's still a champion where you're going to leave your lane. If you ulti away, your opponent will get 2 plates and some waves if you're not getting push, but your lane's not that strong that you can get push around level 6 versus the majority of champions that have combat ultimates. So he's just not a champion that you can be super impactful on consistently unless you're just so good at all of your matchups that you find these windows and you have really good map play as well, which is very, very rare. I've only really seen one Shin that can pull him off, so because of that I'll be keeping him in C tier. Moving down to D tier, and we'll start with Tahm Kench, and I may be underrating him a little bit. He could be C or B tier in lower brackets. I'm just not a fan of this champion. I feel like he doesn't have that much value in the game unless you get really far ahead. And he doesn't really have that many, he's not that good of a blind pick, where if you blind him, you might get countered by strong bruisers like Darius or even Trundle, champs like Fiora later on, or you might verse hard range matchups like Lethal Tempo Vayne. So he's just a champion with a lot of hard matchups, and if you're using Tahm as your counter pick, there is always going to be 5 or 6 better counter picks than this champion, regardless of what you're up against. It's just not a valuable champion in total. Now Karma, she's just not a great top lane champion. She's pretty team reliant. You can pick her if you have like a Graves or a Kindred and you want to play with them, especially if it's your duo, it would make more sense. But she's just a champion that neutralizes the lane and then doesn't scale that well and pretty team reliant, so just not a great solo queue champion. This patch doesn't really change that for me. Now, Skarner, he got pretty shoehorned into jungle, thankfully. He's just a pretty weak top laner, a lot of hard matchups, hard range matchups, or champs like Darius, Olaf, Trundle, or Gwen can give you a lot of trouble, so a champion to stay away from. And as for Yasuo, with lethal tempo he is going to be stronger, however as a top laner, it's pretty impossible to survive ganks up there. You don't have that Yone E escape tool, or Q3 or ulti that you can use so reliably. So you're really vulnerable, and a lot of your hard matchups are a lot harder. So matchups like Jax or Renekton, they are hard for Yone as well, but a lot more playable for Yone than they are for Yasuo, and matchups like Pantheon, you're just going to instantly feed the jungler. You can use him as a counterpick to champs like Gnar, but no one's picking Gnar blind in solo queue pretty much ever, so he's just a champion to stay away from. Unless you're a really good Yasuo already, then it can be fine to use them that 1 in 100 games where they blind pick something where Yasuo's good into. And as for Shyvana, not going to waste too much time if you're picking the champion you want to lose. Alright everyone, let's wrap it up there. And one more thing to keep in mind before I go, keep in mind I did make this tier list after playing on the new patch for 2 days and watching a bunch of games on it. I am going to definitely be moving champions around, but I am extremely confident, I would say, at 80-90% of the champions I've placed on this list, especially the champions in S and A tier. So if you have any questions about them at all, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.